So first of all, I want to thank everybody who's attending this morning, not only all of Hajin's faculty, but all of her fellow E-IPER students, and in particular, those members of her family that are able to attend this morning. One of the most difficult things about introducing Hajin is that there's simply not enough time to try to summarize everything that she has accomplished in her career so far. I first met Hajin when she was a 1L law school student. Hajin came to Stanford in 2011 as a law school student after having a very successful period at Harvard University in the economics department there. Hajin was in my first year property class, and I don't know whether those of you who are faculty have the same sensation that I do, but you always know when you have an absolutely fantastic student, because even 10 years or later after that person has taken your class, you can remember exactly where they sat in the classroom. I mean, if you took out a chart of that classroom, I would be able at this particular point in time to identify the exact seat that Hajin sat in every day. And that was because Hajin participated in that class from the very beginning. And she always had extremely insightful and interesting things to say about every subject that we discussed. While at Stanford Law School, Hajin not only did extremely well in all of her classes, she also served as a research assistant for a number of us. In my particular case, I was serving as a special master for the Supreme Court in a large interstate water dispute, and Hajin served as one of my law clerks. And within a short period of time, she knew more about that case than I swear virtually every lawyer who was arguing that particular case. Hajin also is extremely considerate. A small story, which again, I will remember forever, is that she came into my office one day, and on my desk was a gift I had received from a prior student. It was a small letter opener, but the letter opener was shaped like a duck. And it was all by itself. And the next time Hajin came into my office, she brought in two really extremely nice ducks and gave them to me and explained, and forgive me, Hajin, if I get this wrong, you can correct me later, that having only one duck is not good luck, and that ducks have to be paired up. To this day, those two ducks are very prominent at the front of my desk. After Hajin graduated from Stanford Law School, as many of you know, really successful law school students go on to clerk for judges. And Hajin clerked first for Paul Watford, who's here on the West Coast as part of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. She then came back to work on her PhD dissertation before leaving once again to clerk for Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. During the period of time that she was an E-IPER student, she TA'd in a variety of classes, including my environmental law and policy class, where she taught several of those classes. And I had students coming up to me afterwards and asking whether she could teach the rest of the classes rather than me. She designed a discussion class on corporate social responsibility. This last quarter, she taught a class on private environmental governance. She's lectured in a wide variety of other classes. So as I said, I could go on forever talking about Hajin and all of her accomplishments. I just want to mention two other just sort of general points, though. They're the sort of qualities that to me stand out about Hajin. Number one, she is curious about everything. In fact, that's not only a blessing, but a possible source of consternation for Hajin, because she's always interested in anything that comes up and she wants to be able to delve into it. But maybe because of that, she's also knowledgeable about everything. I don't think I've ever discussed a topic with Hajin where she does not know a great deal about that topic already. So I am very much looking forward to the PhD dissertation presentation this morning on markets, morality, and the environment, and is always learning a tremendous amount. So with that, I will turn things over to Hajin.
Buzz, thank you. That was really kind and too kind. So I'm going to share my screen. Thank you everyone for coming today. I am so grateful for all of your support. A quick word on how I got here. I came to Stanford to study environmental law. I applied to the E-IPER PhD in my first year of law school because I loved law school and realized I wanted to do more research too. Because my undergraduate degree is in economics, as Buzz mentioned, I assumed economics would be my second field. But through my E-IPER coursework, I ended up taking Dale's social norms class, and it completely changed the way I think about research in the world. I never realized until that class how powerfully the law could act through its expressive force, not just through the penalties it might create or threaten. This realization quickly changed how I thought about environmental law as well. So to walk through that, a quick history of the ages of environmental law. We started with common law. A farmer might sue a nearby industrial plant for pollution that ruins her crops. We then decided to more proactively regulate pollution. We first enacted mostly uniform command and control regulations that told all firms to use a particular type of pollution control technology or to pollute at a set level. Economists tend to dislike the command and control because it's more efficient if firms that can reduce pollution more cheaply reduce more pollution than those for whom pollution control is very expensive. They prefer market-based regulations like cap and trade programs or pollution taxes. These create a price incentive to reduce pollution so that firms for whom pollution control is very cheap will naturally reduce more pollution than those for whom pollution control is very expensive. These are now growing in popularity. Then, even more recently, because it's been so hard to enact stronger environmental laws, private efforts, private governance schemes, have grown rapidly. These include corporate social responsibility initiatives and eco-certification schemes like the Forest Stewardship Council that often represent collaborative efforts between industry and civil society. My focus is on these more recent trends, the use of market incentives created by the government or the creation of private regulation by market actors themselves. In the study of these types of regulation, it's customary to consider the influence and role of financial incentives. The point of market-based incentives is to leverage price. And much of the literature on private governance is preoccupied with what these actors are receiving in terms of compensation. Are producers getting better market access? How much of a price premium do these producers receive? And so forth. What is striking about these conversations in the literature is that so little attention is paid to moral incentives and social influence. By moral incentives, I mean that actors care about their moral identity. They want to look and feel like morally good entities. And so they respond to moral considerations. By social influence, I mean the social context in which an act occurs. This is striking to me because environmental harm, any externality really, is inherently a societal harm. It is inherently a problem that the actor inflicts on others. So it seems natural that moral and social incentives might influence behavior. And in a separate project, I worry about what happens to our expectations for appropriate behavior when we assume that societal actors do not and should not care about society. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So long story short, this dissertation hopes to start adding the consideration of moral and social influence to the debates over these environmental policy instruments. The dissertation spans 3 chapters. In the first, I consider patterns of moral judgment, moral tests and opportunities, to understand if and how these patterns systematically influence behavior. In the second, I examine moral and reputational influence on firm behavior. I consider trade-offs between 2 policies intended to encourage firms to pursue more corporate social responsibility. Should policymakers mandate that firms pursue CSR or just explicitly allow it? The third turns to social influences on policymakers crafting market-based regulations. Econ 101 says that absent uncertainty, pollution taxes and cap and trade can be functionally identical. This chapter nonetheless finds a psychological distinction. Negotiators reach more environmentally protective tax than cap and trade policy deals. I'll focus today on chapters 1 and 2, though I'm very happy to talk about chapter 3 in the Q&A. Turning to the first chapter on moral tests and opportunities. Let's start with an example, recycling and composting. We asked study participants to tell us how morally good it is to recycle and to compost by telling us how many moral points from -10 to +10 they would give a person who did each. -10 meant the act was very morally bad, 0 meant neither bad nor good, +10 points meant extremely morally good. You see here in the green that people generally think of recycling and composting as morally good. They gave both positive moral points. And they're roughly equivalent in how morally good they are. Recycling is slightly better, but it's only a marginally significant difference. We also asked study participants to tell us, on a scale of 0 to 100, how likely they would be to recycle and to compost. Here, you see a much bigger difference. People are much more likely to recycle. If it's equally morally good to recycle and to compost, why might people be much more likely to recycle? There are lots of factors involved, but one is the morality of not recycling and of not composting. In gray, you see the negative points people gave for not recycling and not composting. We multiplied these negative points by -1 so we could put them on the same scale as the positive points. So the gray bar essentially tells you how morally bad it is not to do each act. You see that participants reported that it is more immoral to fail to recycle than it is to fail to compost. And that helps to explain the difference in behavioral intention. This chapter makes 2 contributions over 8 sets of studies, of which I'll talk about 6. The first contribution relates to how we measure moral judgments of people. What the moral judgment literature does now is ask how morally good or bad it is to do an act. What we propose here is that it's also important, and in some cases more important, to understand how morally good or bad it might be to not do that same act. So, as we see here, people may be more likely to recycle than to compost because it looks so much worse to be a person who doesn't recycle than a person who doesn't compost. Our first analysis was to consider whether the morality of doing and of not doing many moral acts are correlated. If these are tightly correlated, the morality of not doing a behavior doesn't give us much additional information. We asked participants to rate the morality of doing and not doing 31 moral behaviors, things like keeping a promise, wearing a seatbelt, saying thank you, and so on. We found generally weak correlations. And to establish multicollinearity, to say that the 2 variables are too correlated to stay in one model, you'd want to see correlations around 0.7. It's not really close. Now, as a kind of robustness check, we also repeated this process using 43 acts from 3 prior moral judgment studies, rather than using acts that we had selected. The results were similar and so supported our finding that moral judgments for doing and not doing moral acts are not strongly correlated. The next step is to test whether the morality of not doing an act helps us predict whether a person is likely to do that act. For this test, we used an abstract behavior. We didn't name a behavior like recycling or composting. We instead told participants how morally good or bad it is to do or not do an unnamed behavior. For example, that you as a participant have the opportunity to do a behavior that is very good to do and neither good nor bad not to do. So we varied the morality of doing and not doing the unnamed act. And then we asked participants how likely they were to do that act. We found that the more morally good it is to do an act, the more likely a participant was to say that she would do the act. Likewise, the worse it was to not do an act, the more likely a participant was to say she would do the act. So we found that the morality of not doing the act predicted behavioral intentions, and as the table illustrates, the variable remains significant even when the morality of doing the act is included in the model, and including the morality of not doing improved model fit. Our first contribution is thus that, as a methodological matter, studies of moral judgment should include an evaluation of the moral judgments, both for doing and for not doing the acts being considered. This development of the bivalent moral assessment, looking at both the morality of doing and not doing a behavior, was a necessary stepping stone to the second contribution of this chapter, which was to empirically explore the concepts of moral tests and opportunities. Dale and Benoit Monin, also on this campus, developed these constructs as intuitively useful ways to think about moral judgment. Moral tests are obligations, like not cheating on your partner. You don't look particularly good for passing the test for not cheating, but you feel and look particularly morally bad for failing the test for cheating. Moral opportunities are on the other end of the spectrum, so one example might be donating a kidney. You feel particularly good for seizing an opportunity, but not so bad about not seizing it. These are super useful ways to think about my work in particular on how the law and social norms can shape expectations. If a law mandates you do something, it usually creates a moral test. If it instead merely allows something, it usually creates a moral opportunity. And moral tests are kind of downers. More people comply with the test, but you don't like being subject to it, there's only potential downside. So you might look for ways out. On the opposite end, opportunities sound then very intriguing, but they can lead to moral licensing. If you bike to work, maybe you think it's okay not to walk the extra 5 steps to recycle later that day. These constructs are useful even in everyday life. My husband loves thinking about acts in terms of tests and opportunities, primarily because if he's forgotten to do something, like pick something up from the store, he's quick to tell me that it was really an opportunity, not a test, and so I shouldn't be annoyed. To explore these concepts, we looked at moral points and evaluations to see if these patterns seem to exist as predicted. We then considered emotions to see if they follow similar patterns. And finally, behavior to see if the moral coding of an act predicts behavior. Starting with moral points. To explain the plot, here gray bars are the negative moral points for doing the bad side of an act, again, multiplied by -1. It's a little confusing to talk about doing and not doing an act here because the negative side of causing physical harm is doing the act, causing harm, while the negative side of stopping at a red light, in contrast, is not doing the act, not stopping. I'm happy to talk more about omission-commission distinctions in the Q&A. So what does this plot tell us? It looks like acts do seem to fall generally on a spectrum of moral tests to opportunities. People thought it much worse to cause physical harm and to litter than it was good to not cause physical harm and to not litter. These are moral tests. On the opposite side of the spectrum, people thought it much better to give to charity and to compost than it was morally bad to not donate to charity and to not compost. These are moral opportunities. So the moral point patterns seem to generally support the idea of these two constructs. Turning to emotions. For this study, we asked participants how strongly they would feel different emotions when they imagine themselves doing and not doing 10 moral acts. We also asked them to give us moral points for doing and not doing each act. Using the moral points, we categorize the acts as moral tests or opportunities. Again, opportunities are when the positive moral points for doing the good side of the act are greater than the negative moral points for doing the bad side of the act. And moral tests are the reverse. We found, for example, composting was again a moral opportunity and stealing was a moral test. We then looked at the patterns of emotional responses, and we found patterns that match theory. In this plot, yellow bars represent happiness and gray bars sadness. The left 2 bars on each chart represent the how you feel about doing the bad side of an act for not composting and for not stealing, while the right 2 bars are for emotions felt doing the good side for composting and for not stealing. We find that people report more happiness when they imagine themselves seizing opportunities, for example, for composting, than they report sadness for not doing so. In contrast, they report more sadness for failing a moral test, for example, for stealing, than happiness for passing the test, for not stealing. We find a similar pattern with pride and guilt, and also with positive and negative affect, which I don't picture here. This is a nice convergent validation measure. Moral points provide more potential for upside than downside in both moral points evaluations and here for emotions, while moral tests provide more potential for downside than upside in both as well. Finally, behavior. Using the moral behaviors previously studied, we find that participants report more behavioral intentions to pass tests, to do the good side of tests, than to seize opportunities. People are more likely to intend to comply with moral tests. But to go beyond behavioral intention to actual behavior, we used the 2018 midterm election. Before the election, we asked participants to tell us how morally good or bad it was to do and not do a set of acts, including voting in the upcoming election, and we limited participants to eligible voters. After the election, we asked participants if they voted. The red bar is the people who coded the voting as a test, and the blue bar are people who coded voting as an opportunity. We found that a higher percentage of those who coded voting as a test ended up voting than those who coded voting as an opportunity. So again, moral tests appear to encourage more compliance with the behavior. So where do we go from here? This project just set the groundwork. There's a lot more to explore. We'd like to continue looking at behavior and emotions, especially trade-offs. I talked about how moral opportunities might create moral licensing, and I worry that moral tests might create reactance. It'd also be useful as a policy matter to understand how to move an act from an opportunity to a test, if tests do encourage more compliance. I worry when you do that, though, you might create extra reactance, much like the very quick and sudden reversal on face masks seem to be creating a lot of reactance. And so I'd also be interested in looking into how to maybe soften the reactance that occurs. Ultimately, I'd like to explore how to use these insights in policy design, and I start that project in the next chapter. In this chapter, I'm looking at trade-offs between mandating and allowing corporate social responsibility, or CSR. I define CSR as corporate concern for and efforts to improve society beyond specific legal requirements that mandate particular working conditions or environmental controls. CSR is all over the news. Companies left and right are making climate pledges, promising to reduce water use, and otherwise unveiling efforts to improve the sustainability of their operations. These are significant efforts on their own. Walmart's initiative to remove a gigaton of greenhouse gases from its value chain by 2030 is more than what the Clean Power Plan aspired to. These efforts can also accelerate technology development and hopefully reduce opposition to governmental regulation. So corporate behavior has huge potential to improve environmental outcomes. The problem is that people think corporations are legally required to maximize only shareholder welfare, to maximize profits. And that belief can inhibit corporate actors from doing more for society. This project thus considers options for altering that legal requirement. Instead of requiring corporations to maximize profits, what if we either explicitly allowed or corporate directors to consider societal consequences or required them to do so? To make this more concrete, I'll talk about 3 corporate governance models. The shareholder welfare maximization principle stems from corporate director fiduciary duties. Under the prohibited model, corporate directors may not manage the corporation for societal benefit. They have to maximize shareholder welfare. This is arguably the status quo approach. I say arguably because there's a lively debate on whether this accurately represents the law, but many people believe that it does. This is especially a fight with respect to corporate behemoth Delaware, where over 60% of the Fortune 500 is incorporated. Under the allowed model, corporate directors may manage the corporation for societal benefit. Constituency statutes in around 33 states have already enacted this model into law. Delaware is not one of them. Under the required approach, directors must manage the corporation for societal benefit. We have versions of this approach already as benefit corporation statutes in some 30 states, though they're different because these benefit corporation statutes are opt-in. So corporations have to explicitly incorporate under the benefit corporation statute for it to apply. Delaware, for example, has a benefit corporation statute, but it's opt-in. For the required approach I'll talk about today, however, I mean a regime that would automatically apply so that all corporations, or all corporations that are big enough, would be required to care about society. That's the approach already in effect in some countries, and the one many are proposing to enact. The focus today is on the allowed and required approaches. Legal scholars generally dislike constituency statutes and the allowed approach. It creates only a shield to protect directors who are accused of foregoing profits for societal benefit. They prefer we have a sword, that we have a means to force directors to proactively care. But there's a problem with this reasoning. Corporate director fiduciary duties are not formally enforceable as a practical matter because of the business judgment rule. So if a shareholder sues the corporation, say Walmart, and says, your gigaton project is going to detract from my corporate profits, that shareholder is almost certain to lose. Courts typically strongly defer to the business judgment of the corporation. There isn't an authoritative formulation of the rule, but courts generally say, look, we are not expert on what could be the best for the company. So as long as there's some conceivable reason that decision could have increased profits, we're not going to get involved. So Walmart could say, well, we want to entice socially responsible investors and employees to work with us. And so this, we think, could be profitable, and then it'd be fine. Now, the business judgment rule applies both to the mandate of profit maximization, to the prohibited approach, and the mandate of social responsibility, the required approach. The proposed social responsibility mandates and the model benefit corporation legislation today explicitly include the business judgment rule. And even if you weren't going to include it, it's hard to know how courts could practically enforce the mandate. How much social responsibility does a firm have to do, and when can it choose profits to remain a going enterprise? This means that we actually have to rely on reputation and moral motivations to change firm behavior. We have to rely on the expressive power of law, not its formal coercive tools. So, what are the moral and reputational trade-offs under the two policy options, the two new alternatives? The allowed approach sets up a moral opportunity. Companies acting voluntarily will get more moral credit, like a high school student who volunteers without a community service requirement for graduation. That student looks better than one who volunteers because she has to. The required approach sets up a moral test. Companies may look worse for not acting pro-socially because they are required to act pro-socially. And that there's a mandate in the law might signal that society finds this more important. To test these hypotheses, I ran two sets of analyses. First, I ran two reputation studies asking whether firms are rewarded more for pro-social action in the allowed approach, but penalized more for not acting pro-socially in the required approach. I then ran a behavior study, an incentive compatible study, to see, do people do more pro-social action when in the required condition than the allowed? All three studies were pre-registered. Today, I'll focus on the reputation studies, and I'll talk about just one. In these studies, participants learned that Jones Corp is a t-shirt manufacturer, deciding whether to use a more expensive but more environmentally friendly cotton supplier. Switching would definitively lower Jones Corp's profits, but would be better for the environment. So the question is, how does switching change participants' willingness to interact with Jones Corp? I randomly assigned participants to three statutory conditions. Jones Corp was either prohibited from, allowed to, or required to consider society in its decisions. I sought to understand whether assignment to these conditions altered participant willingness to buy from, invest in, and work for the company when it does and does not decide to act pro-socially. I chose these items because a change in consumer, employee, or investor behavior is likely to influence corporate decisions. If a pro-social decision causes, on the aggregate, sales to increase, then companies may be more likely to make more pro-social decisions in the future. The hypothesis was that being allowed to do good would lead to greater rewards, to greater increases in willingness to work, willingness to buy, work from, and invest in the company, while being required to do good would lead to greater penalties for not doing good. One study used online participants, and the other used leading university alumni. I'll talk today about the leading university alumni study. This was a pre-registered experiment with 204 participants. To walk through my hypotheses in the experimental setup, I'll use a simplified structural equation modeling diagram. The idea is that being required to act pro-socially would make it seem like Jones Corp has less freedom to decide whether to act pro-socially or not. So, when Jones Corp does act pro-socially, that decision doesn't make Jones Corp look like it especially cares about the environment. The circle around perceived care just means that this was a composite variable. And because it looks like it doesn't care as much when it does act pro-socially, participants would be less willing to reward Jones Corp with higher willingness to buy from, work for, and invest in the company. And when Jones Corp does not act pro-socially, the opposite occurs. It looks like it especially does not care about the environment. It didn't do the environmentally good thing even when it was required to. So participants would punish it more in terms of lower willingness to interact measures. A quick note before looking at the data, you'll see data on all three of the conditions, prohibited, allowed, and required. The main focus though is on the allowed versus required condition, but I include the prohibited, the arguable status quo, to see if patterns there also fit intuitions. Now, as predicted, when Jones Corp was required to act pro-socially, was required to either act pro-socially or was forbidden from acting pro-socially, it looked like it had less freedom to decide whether to act pro-socially or not as compared to when it was allowed to act pro-socially. For all the plots going forward, the dark gray bars are the prohibited group, the blue bars are the allowed group, and the red bars are the required approach. So when Jones Corp decided to do the Pro-Social Act, participants didn't think that Jones Corp that the decision signaled that Jones Corp particularly cared about the environment. When Jones Corp was merely allowed to, but not required to act pro-socially, its decision to switch suppliers made it look like it cared more. And as predicted, this led more allowed participants to reward Jones Corp. So more allowed than required participants reported that because of Jones Corp's pro-social decision, they'd be more willing to buy from Jones Corp, more willing to work for Jones Corp, and more willing to invest in Jones Corp. Although the investment decision, this is not a statistically significant difference. The other two are. Now turning to what happens when Jones Corp decides not to act pro-socially. When Jones Corp was required to act pro-socially, but did not, it looked like it especially didn't care about the environment as predicted. And so when Jones Corp chose not to act pro-socially, as predicted, more required than allowed participants reported being less willing to buy, less willing to work for, and less willing to invest in Jones Corp than the allowed participants. I'll quickly summarize the results, including those I didn't have time to get into today, before I touch on implications. In the reputation study, required participants rewarded less for doing the pro-social act, but punished more for not doing the pro-social act. Now, these differences mostly disappeared when I later told participants that there was no enforcement of the rule. In the behavior experiment, required participants initially did more pro-social acts, but again, the difference disappeared when they were told there would be no enforcement of the rule. So they walked back their pro-social action. So what does this all mean? I started this project because I worried the mandatory approach that everyone seems to like might backfire. And I found that it could if what we want is to use reputational rewards to encourage more pro-social behavior. This is especially true because of who is likely to learn that a pro-social mandate is unenforceable. Stakeholders, consumers and employees at least, are unlikely to know about the business judgment rule. But the regulated entities themselves are quite likely to know that they can't be held to account under the rule. And that is the worst combination, because it means stakeholders will reward companies for doing less good, so the incentive to do good is less. But they think the companies are supposed to do good anyways. But companies may not themselves, absent those rewards, act more pro-socially because they know they don't have to. That doesn't mean, though, that the voluntary approach is necessarily better, because there are too many open empirical questions. First, to reward or punish, stakeholders have to learn about the good or bad acts. Companies are way more likely to talk about the good things they do, as many of you probably suspect, suggesting rewards might be better. But third parties, the media, civil society, may be able to unearth the bad things or company inaction, and these third parties may be more credible, suggesting penalties could be better. Second, stakeholders may prefer penalties to reward. They may prefer to screen out bad products rather than actively choose good ones or pay extra for good ones. And it also matters how firms respond to both types of regimes. So I suspect firms are loss averse with respect to their reputations, so punishments may be more motivating. So more firms may be trying just to not be bad actors than to be proactively good actors. I mean, think about Google's model. It's not to be good, it's don't be evil. So we don't know whether more firms are motivated by penalties or by rewards, the extensive margin. How strongly penalties or rewards might influence firm behavior, the intensive margin. And maybe most importantly, how best to motivate the firms that are best positioned to influence industry practice or governmental regulation. Now, this raises questions about theories of governance. For me, I tend to think of voluntary private efforts as extra credit, as acts we want to encourage firms to take on to show proof of concept, to experiment, and to create a race to the top. And that would suggest the voluntary allowed approach is better. But when we look at corporate leaders now, Unilever and Nestle with sustainable palm oil, Nike with overseas labor, these companies didn't start to care until there were concerted naming and shaming campaigns against them. So an important question is, how can we use punishments, if they are actually more motivating in this way, to encourage companies to then become leaders like these companies? That's all to say that there is not an obvious answer yet to which approach might dominate. There's so much left here to study, which is, for me as a researcher, very exciting, although possibly less exciting for policymakers. But one concrete takeaway relevant here for research is that using the law, we can change the baseline for what is expected and appropriate behavior, and that can change the social meaning of the behavior. And this is at bottom what I think the corporate governance discussions today is missing. Taking a step back, my dissertation and education here at Stanford has led me to realize that moral and social influence are worthy of independent study, both for individual and for firm behavior. In the future, I hope to continue working on the projects I started here on moral coding, on changing corporate norms and expectations, and on price and quantity regulations, which is the chapter I didn't have time to talk about today.
Okay, so we have our first question. So the first question is from Eleanor. And Eleanor, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks so much for a great presentation, Hajin. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about the participants in your moral tests and opportunity studies and the extent to which you think that they're representative of external populations, and so therefore how we might also think about generalizability from these studies.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a really good and important question, particularly with the moral coding studies. The moral coding, part of what our contribution is the understanding that moral coding can change and change by context. So for example, recycling is probably a moral test on Stanford campus, but all of the participants we used who are online participants through the survey platforms, MTurk, Amazon Mechanical Turk, and Prolific, they basically all said that it was an opportunity, and that's as expected, right? So if many people around you, if the descriptive norms are very, very high, are recycling, then that might become more of a moral test. And so, you know, one thing that would be super interesting now is to see how does the moral coding of wearing face masks change across different geographies, and as people see more and more incidents of COVID. And so this wasn't, we didn't mean to get external validity in the sense of saying these participants' views are representative of, you know, many other people's views of a particular act. We were instead trying to say, is this sort of mechanistically the way people might think about things? Do they care more? Do they actually care at all about the morality of not doing an act? And that, we think, is a mechanism that would apply across different populations. For the Voting Act in particular, we used only eligible US voters. And so that was hopefully a little bit more representative.
Great, thank you, Eleanor. So next is Francis. Francis, would you like to read your question?
Hi, Hajin. Thanks so much. It was a fascinating presentation. I think you mentioned at the beginning you had a study, if I'm right, about cap and trade versus carbon tax. I'd be super interested to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Fran.
Hi.
Yeah, so that study was a negotiation study. So what we did is we went to 13 different negotiation classes, and we randomly assigned students into pairs to negotiate either a cap and trade policy or a pollution tax policy. We said this is a novel pollutant X. It causes all this local environmental and health damage, and you are legislators and you have to get to an agreement on a bill. Within each negotiation pair, one person represented business interests and one person represented environmental interests. And so we had them negotiate over four policy metrics. So how stringent the cap and trade level and or the pollution tax level was, the regulatory phase-in, so how quickly it would come in, how many offsets could be used, and finally, how much of the revenue from the cap and trade program, which was all going to be auctioned, and in order to be equivalent to the tax, and the revenue from the tax would go into environmental remediation or to corporate income tax reductions. And what we found is that those randomly assigned to negotiate the tax reached more environmentally protective deals than those randomly assigned to negotiate the cap and trade bill. Now, this is super interesting because you see a very similar pattern if you look across actual carbon prices in the world today. So generally, those that are subject to carbon taxes have higher prices than those subject to cap and trade. And there's lots of reasons for that are already well known, as you, Fran, in particular, are probably very familiar with. So with complementary policies, if you have other policies that also reduce that pollution, if you have renewable portfolio standards that require a reduction in greenhouse gases anyways, what that does with the cap and trade program is it reduces demand for credits under the cap and trade program. And so that's going to depress the price in the cap and trade program. Whereas the complementary policies next to a tax don't do anything similar. The tax stays just as stringent. And so it's hard to tell, looking at just that real world data, is there a psychological bias that might also be driving this difference? And so we did this controlled experiment to tease that out, and we found that it does.
Thanks, super.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So our next question is from you, Ruying. Ruying, would you like to read your question?
Yeah, hi, Hajin.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good. My question is about the voting section. Just wondering if the voting info was collected by survey, would people say that voting is morally required, be more compelled to say they voted, even if they didn't?
Yeah, that's totally possible. And so that's a problem with this type of instrument, right? If you notice the numbers, they're also extremely high. So people reported over 75% of people reported that they had voted. And if you look at the voting literature, this is apparently just generally a problem across survey literature and even like the polling data. People recognize that voting is something they're supposed to do, and so they might be more likely to say that they did it, which is kind of crazy. But in any case, that's definitely a potential problem with here. And it's possible that, one cut of the data that I haven't done that would be really interesting is to actually do it based on levels. So if people think it is much, much, much worse not to vote, but still also give 10 positive points for voting, like, does that also result in similar patterns? I think that kind of analysis could help tease this out a little, but it's unfortunately just a problem with this method.
Got it. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So our next question is from Andrea. Andrea, would you like to read your question?
I'm curious if you've presented your results to policymakers, and if you have, how have they received them?
I have not presented any of these results to the policymakers. The cap and trade program, the cap and trade versus pollution chapter, I have talked to a few folks in civil society, although not policy. Actually, I did talk about it to one person who's designing a transportation cap and trade program, but not as much as I would like to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So our next question is from Kieran, and the question is, what are some of the future directions you are most excited about?
Oh, hi, Kieran. So I love that question. There's so many future directions I'm really excited about. But the one that I want to wrap up these projects too, but I'm really interested in this idea of the self-fulfilling expectation of profit maximization. So if consumers expect that companies can only profit maximize, if they go to Whole Foods and see fair trade coffee, they may think, oh, that's like a scam. I'm not going to pay more for that. No company would actually go out of their way to be socially responsible. And so it feels like this expectation, and employees similarly might say, oh, I'm not going to agitate at my company to care about its greenhouse gas emissions because my company won't do anything that's not profit maximizing. And so it seems like this expectation of profit maximization can handicap and actually lead to lower profits, where if employees say, like, actually I do care about this and I'm willing to take lower wages, or consumers say, like, I do think this matters and I think companies can care about society and I'm willing to pay more for that, then you can align societal interests and private interests much more. And so the expectation that companies can and should care about society, I think, it could create more win-win opportunities, basically. And so that's just a theory that I'm working with right now, but I'd love to test it out empirically. I've done a few pilots that seem to suggest it does work in that way, but they are not incentive compatible yet. So I need to figure this all out.
Wonderful, thank you. So another question is, it seems the lack of enforcement because of the business judgment rule is the big assumption of your research. Can you explain more what the support for your assumption is, or is it not an assumption?
It's definitely a huge assumption. This is just well known in the corporate law, and it's a really it's just in the U.S. So let me give you an example of a case. So there's this Wrigley case where in Chicago, the owner of the Chicago baseball team didn't want to have night games because he just didn't want to have lights up. Basically, he thought it'd be bad for the neighborhood, and he never said, in fact, that this would be somehow bad for profits. And most people thought like it would certainly be good for profits to do night games because so many people came out to the night games. And all of the other teams, there was not a single other team that didn't have night games. But the court, and so shareholders sued, and they basically said, like, how can you not have night games? This is wrong. And the court basically said, oh, it's totally fine. Like, he said he cared about the neighborhood, and maybe if you care about the neighborhood, like that will attract more people to the games later. And the court effectively said, oh, because of the business judgment rule, it's conceivable there's a reason why this could end up being more profitable, even though you, defendant, did not come up with that reason. So we're just going to find the reason for you. And that is just how deferential the business judgment rule is. So it's possible that you could have a less deferential business judgment rule. That is, a decision by the courts. But even if you had a less deferential business judgment rule, I'm not sure how you could enforce some of these mandates. So like, let's say it's even a decision between two socially good things. Like you have a factory and you can locate it somewhere else and it will be less polluting. But locating somewhere else will hurt the community that you're in, and like those people will lose jobs. How is a court going to be able to weigh those two and say one is better than the other? It's very hard to enforce. And so I think just formal enforcement through the courts is not a likely possibility. Now, one thing courts could do is, instead of enforcing the substantive guarantees, instead of saying, oh, you're actually being socially responsible, they could enforce the procedural things. So they could say, you have to disclose what you're doing and how you're deciding things. And that of course could help motivate behavior, but that type of enforcement could apply equally to the allowed approach and the required approach, if that helps.
Thank you. So our next question is from Jim. Jim, would you like to read your question?
There. Thanks, Gabrielle. And congratulations, Hajin. That was fantastic. I wonder if you're going to guess this question. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the implications of these dynamics for private efforts like the Forest Stewardship Council that you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, so I guess a few things. In terms of the self-fulfilling expectations theory that I touched on but wasn't part of the presentation, I mean, most of my motivation for that work is because I think those efforts are being handicapped by the theory of profit maximization. But setting that aside and going to just the like the allowed versus required approach, I mean, both I think would be really helpful for things like FSC, MSC, because in a way it doesn't matter, because companies aren't going to get sued because of the business judgment rule. They're not going to get sued if they decide to forego profits for FSC or MSC. But I think if you allow people to say, like, I am actually just doing this for societal benefit, it does liberate them and feel like they're not in this weird limbo where they have to say, oh no, I'm going to make up a reason why this will somehow be profitable, even if it's not going to be, because I have a duty to do that. So I think both the allowed and required approaches could benefit those types of private efforts, and that would be my hope.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, so the next question is, how much of a difference do you think it would make to investors, consumers, and prospective employees to make them more aware of the business judgment rule? Could this be low-hanging fruit since it doesn't require any legislative changes?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think in some ways absolutely, and that's, there's a great piece by Einar Elhag that basically says, like, of course, managers can sacrifice profits for the greater good, for society. And he leans really heavily on the business judgment rule for this. And so I think that was a little bit part of this project, although he also has other very good reasons. I think for the reason, for what I was just talking about with Jim, I think it's maybe not enough, because what the business judgment rule says is, look, you may have this formal legal duty to maximize profits, but you can get away with not having to do that. And it's a little weird to say, like, you should act morally by getting away with not doing something that is your formal legal duty. So I think it can get us some of the way there, but it, you know, my preference would be for it to be a clear statement of law, basically.
Okay, just keeping my eye on the time. It looks like maybe, Hajin, do you think we have time for one or two more questions, or just one?
Just one, sure.
Just
one would
one?
be great.
Okay. All right. So next up is Greg. Greg, would you like to read your question?
Hi, Greg.
Sure. Hey, Hajin. So in terms of sort of takeaways, I was just wondering if, kind of synthesizing everything you've seen here, can you envision some way to essentially have your cake and eat it too, in terms of having really strong mandates, but still rewarding companies in some way who go above and beyond and help pave the way for more sustainable practices in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing that's a little bit lost in the way I present this is that even under the mandate, under the required approach, it's still like people still reward the companies. It's just that they reward the companies less, right? So it's just somewhat of a diminished incentive. But I think the way to really have your cake and eat it too is actually through the benefit corporation approach, because there, if you incorporate as a benefit corporation, you signal like, no, the reason why I'm going to be subject to this extra requirement in this law is because I am morally motivated. So when you do the moral things, it's not a muddy signal anymore. It's not like, oh, maybe he's doing it because, or this company is doing it because it has to. They chose to be subject to that requirement. Now, this is not quite having your cake and eating it too, because the drawback there is, you know, there are just so few companies that are benefit corporations right now. And I think having the explicit benefit corporation option available makes it seem even more clear that anyone who's not a benefit corporation shouldn't care about society and should only profit maximize. And so, you know, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think there are ways we can get closer to having your cake and eating it too, but I'm not positive there's like a full way to do that, unfortunately.
Great. I just want to say congrats, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I have been unbelievably lucky in my committee members who have been nothing but supportive in my pretty unorthodox academic path. As Buzz mentioned, I took 2 years off to clerk and then I had a baby. And the only pushback I got was concern that I wasn't taking enough maternity time off. So I want to thank all of you individually, but just to say that at the outset. Buzz, you're an amazing teacher and mentor. You told me once that the best papers don't just spot issues, they try to build and test solutions, and that continues to inspire my work. I hope I can be as thoughtful and engaging in the classroom and as practical and wise outside of it as you are. Dale, your class was transformative for me, and almost all of my research builds on your ideas. But what I'm most grateful for is how kind, supportive, and generous you are. You've read every draft, you're always available to talk through my harebrained ideas, and you sometimes even tell me that they're not that harebrained. As you know, I've had so much imposter syndrome in this process, and half of my confidence is from your kindness. So thank you. Rob, I'm so grateful to Dale for telling me to come find you when you came to Stanford. Every time I go into your office, not sure of how to pursue something, you have so many thoughts and ideas, and I leave feeling super excited about all of the possibilities. You have an incredibly contagious love for research. One of my regrets about the PhD process is that I didn't get to follow up on that crowding project with you, so hopefully we can do that sometime in the future. Eric, you have consistently pushed me to expect more of myself and of my work, and to think about real world implications and conditions. You were the first person I met in E-IPER. You were so generous to meet with me even before I had applied to any kind of graduate school. And I'm so grateful I got to work with you. It's a funny story. You tried, I think, at one point to encourage me to find a different advisor because our work is so dissimilar. But I'm so grateful you gave in when I said, no, please, I would really like to work with you and keep learning from you. So thank you. Gabrielle, I really admire and respect your work and how closely you work with your students. And I'm so appreciative that you agreed to chair this defense for me because I really wanted an opportunity to meet you. Okay, so the slide is for all the people without whom this defense would not be possible. So E-IPER, especially Anne-Marie and Gabby, who put so much into putting all this together despite the pandemic and this weird new virtual format. I'm so grateful for all of my funders, both for the PhD and for the specific research. I had so many collaborators. I just had so many collaborators for all of these projects. And so Dale and Julian for the moral coding, Casey for the price quantity work, and for the price quantity work, many negotiation professors, but especially Jan, who really took Casey and me under her wing and whom we both truly admire. I'm so lucky for my many mentors at the law school and through E-IPER who have taught me how to think, research, and write. Al Sykes and Mark Kelman have been especially kind and generous champions for me. Al, I hope my work is half as sharp as yours. And Mark, you're like family. Jim, I am so grateful you agreed to co-teach with me this past quarter. It was such a privilege to work with you. I learned so much from you, and it was just also super enjoyable, which was lovely. I'm thankful to my many homes on campus that have helped me stay accountable and helped me workshop my work. I'm not sure how to begin going over this list of friends and colleagues who have been so supportive and so encouraging. So my best friends from my college roommates, Melanie, Glenda, Julie, Shanshan, Mal, my best friends from law school, Christina and Angie, Isha and Darren, my E-IPER cohort, which is effectively 3 cohorts because I kept taking time off and everyone still kept welcoming me back. You guys are amazing, and I can't wait for the pandemic to be over so that I can see you all again. Finally, and most importantly, my family. It's super hard to thank family because the words feel really superficial. Amma and Appa, I don't know how Sean and I would have survived the past 3 months, 4 months without you. Thank you for always taking care of us, for inspiring us, and for giving us the best advice, even if I still sometimes act like a teenager who doesn't want it. I hope I can be anywhere close as wise and generous with Ginu as you are with me and Hannah. Hannah, you are the best big brother I could ask for. You were my first role model, and I really wish you would move back because I super miss you. Sean, I think you like my ideas more than I do. You've been that strong of a supporter, and you are that biased in my favor. Thank you for taking care of me through nearly a decade of law school, clerkships, and parental leave. I couldn't have done any of this without you. And last but not least, I'd like to thank our baby Ginu for giving us so much joy. And on that note, I apologize, all of these defenses usually have really cool pictures of people's research, but I am horrible at taking pictures, and so I didn't have any cool research pictures. So instead, I will leave you with a cute picture of Ginu. So thank you, everyone.